Okay, so welcome everybody. It's great to be having the opportunity to do this. Thanks very much to Ellen and to everyone behind the scenes who've put this together. I had a fantastic experience watching John Hutchison do his talk yesterday, and I found the whole thing fascinating. So hope that this will be useful for you. So the talk is about Rosenshine and the curriculum. What's the connection? And not everybody will have read Rosenshine's principles, so I think it's worth saying a little bit about the fact that the paper that I'm talking about is this one. There's an image of it there. So this, this is my tatty copy. And the reason why I've been doing a lot of work and talking about Rosenshine is just because when I go to schools and I'm asked to sort of present about research informed teaching, people often say, well, what's the easiest thing to use? And Rosenshine's principles is just a really good summary of some really simple and good ideas about how to teach, which are common across lots of subjects. So that's the reason why it's so popular, is because it covers quite a lot of things and it's easily accessible, but it's a free PDF. You just download it, and I really recommend people reading it. So whatever else you do, go and read the paper if you've not done it before. In my work on it, I've used a kind of I summarize it into these 4 strands, which I found useful because it connects some of the principles. There are 10 principles of instruction, and each one of these things is provides a common language for teachers to talk about. So it does have a value as a generic kind of basis for talking about teaching and learning. So reviewing material, and we're going to talk about that more in the session. And significantly, the difference between daily review and weekly and monthly review is important to look at. Questioning, everybody asks questions, but it's about the sorts of questions you ask and how you involve all your students in responding. So clearly that's common. Another key, we all have to sequence concepts and model things in our curriculum. That's a key thing we're going to focus on in the session. And finally, practice, going from guided practice to independent practice. So the reason why Rosenshine's principles are useful and popular is because all of those things are common across a school, and therefore you can form a common language and talk about things together, which is very sensible. But of course, all of those are totally generic, and none of them actually make any sense unless you are talking about the material that is involved. So I did a thing recently, I was going to talk about this slide for a minute here, talking about the curriculum implications of Rosenshine. It's one of my more recent blog posts. And really all of it is a curriculum-based thing. So once you've got a common language for this stuff in your school, of course, the detailed discussion is really at a curriculum level, and you can't really go very far until you start talking about, well, what exactly do we mean? So for example, sequencing, concepts and modeling, that's really what you're doing when you're curriculum planning. And the main part of this talk is going through that in some detail. Questioning. Now, of course, and I think this is probably the most valid generic thing about Rosenshine, is that the genericism is, it comes to all of us. We do all have to ask questions in a class. We do all need to engage everyone in a room, and the mechanics of running a room are common to everybody, regardless of what you're actually teaching. And this is actually one of the difficulties I think teachers often have, is involving everybody, and the curriculum that you've designed needs to reach everyone in the room, and that's the hardest part. But of course, then the types of questions you're asking are very specific to the curriculum, and the maths questions that you ask in languages, or good questions in history, that has a curriculum element. So there's the mechanics of running the room are generic, but the curriculum aspect has to be thought through. Practice is another thing. So it's useful to talk about practice and the difference between guiding practice and independent practice. But of course, what exactly are you doing in the practice is all about curriculum thinking. And after an initial conversation about practice, you can't really go very far unless you're talking to your colleagues in the same subject, saying, well, how do we get them to practice this, that, and the other? And what does it look like when we've gone to the more independent stage? And finally, retrieval practice. There are lots of good general ideas about retrieval practice. We're going to look at some of those. But the nature of any activity you're doing, the questions you're asking, the type of review that you're engaging in, has a curriculum thing. So sometimes people talk about this idea of curriculum trumps pedagogy, or the other way around. And I always think, well, you know, you can't end up with a fantastic education if the curriculum plan is poor. So that's definitely true. But at the same time, this is where the castles come in. You know, you have to work out where you're at. Now, some people are spending a lot of time designing the curriculum, which for me this represents the, you know, the castle. What is a castle? What's a fabulous castle? And maybe sometimes getting a bit bogged down in the minutiae, the detail, the kind of the precision of the definition of the curriculum. But of course, that castle, if you're trying to build a sandcastle version, that you have to attend to how that's delivered. And sometimes I think that the curriculum you want to teach is brilliant, just that's good enough. What your issue is you need to get that across to every learner in the room, not just a few, but all of them. And that's kind of the priority for some people. It's really the pedagogical implementation. It's how you make that curriculum come alive. And of course, it's different from one student to another. So you do need to think about where you're at as a group of people. Sometimes I see teachers who, you know, the curriculum is the weakness. You know, they could probably teach anything well, but what the material they're trying to deliver isn't as ambitious as it could be, for example. So the curriculum is a focus. So I don't think there's a general rule about one thing trumps the other. It's absolutely evident to me that it really depends, and it can depend within a school or within even a department in the school, where the way people are you know, spending their time, is it the thing which is the bottleneck for the students. So you need to think about that for yourself. You know, where are we at with our curriculum planning? And do we really need to go even more detail, just defining the specifics of what we'd like to teach? Or is our issue really that we're just not getting it through you know, rigorously enough to all of the students? And it's that emphasis on all of them. I think, you know, most teachers are able to teach a good proportion of the students, but it's getting into the corners. That's where the weaknesses lie. You know, where not everybody is thriving in every lesson, and that's the heart of the complexity of teaching. That it's simultaneously teaching a whole group of people at the same time, and that's where we need to be thinking. Well, I think that's where Rosenshine's principles really come into their own. Okay, so one of the things I think is worth looking at is this, which is the model of learning, which underpins a lot of what Rosenshine's talking about. He talks about schema building, and he talks about the fact that when we're learning something, we're building on what we already know, and that's implicit in this idea of sequencing concepts and modeling. And when I do a training in a school, I often get people to look at that slide and to discuss what does it tell us. And I've had this quite interesting conversation with Oliver Cariglioli, my partner in crime, about this arrow here, because you obviously pay attention to the environment, you decide what to pay attention to, but it also represents taking information in. And of course we interact with our environment. We're not just sitting there taking stuff in, we're doing things to things, and they come back to us, and it's the kind of a loop. But this cycle here is really important, that, you know, when we're learning, we are storing things in our memory, which we can then remember and use. And working memory is finite, so we have to break things down into small steps. Originally, John did a fantastic job explaining that yesterday. But unless we process things in relation to what we already know, we can forget them. We can do things miraculously in some ways without really remembering them later, unless we consciously engage with our prior knowledge and make connections. And the more often we do that, the more often we activate prior knowledge, bring it back into our working memory, use it, add new information. The more often we do that, the better we get at doing it, the more fluent we become, and this pathway becomes something which we can then think about as being automatic, and fluency is an idea which is really important. But this is important that this doesn't happen by itself. So a big part of what we need to be doing as teachers is actively engaging the prior knowledge in a deliberate way, and constructing activities which make students think about that, so that then it's more likely to be stored in the long term. And it is amazing to me how often task completion trumps kind of thinking in lessons. You see this a lot, where the teachers are getting students to do things, and they say, have you finished? Have you done it yet? And actually, they're not saying, have you learnt it, have you understood it? And that emphasis on doing, done, finished, complete is, I find, extraordinarily dominant over understanding, and switching that round to thinking and talking about understanding is a big thing. So Rosenshine's check for understanding is really key. I just realised I'm just going to stop this share a minute, because I realise that when I'm in this mode, I can't actually see what the time is. So we're going to have a look at that, and now I'm going to go back to sharing that, which is a bit of a sad thing to admit, but there you go. So moving on, this idea of knowledge building on knowledge is a really important thing for curriculum thinking. You've got some ideas out there and you want to add to them. Now you have to check that the students have got the knowledge that you're expecting them to have, because you're going to add some more to that and add more to that and then make a connection to this. And one of the big challenges in teaching is the fact that a lot of what we're teaching is cumulative. It builds and builds. But if the stuff which is expected to be there before isn't there, then your students are cut adrift. And the main reason why some students struggle at school is because they're in lessons where the teacher is assuming they have knowledge that they don't actually have, or a level of confidence and fluency with that which is expected and is missing. Which means part of teaching, an embedded and everyday part of teaching, is checking that the knowledge you're assuming is there for everybody, not just a few, for everybody. And it's the hardest part, it's the hardest bit to get right. And if we cut corners, and I have met teachers who just, and I've done it myself, you sort of get frustrated. You think, well, you should know it, so look, I have to teach this stuff. You should know this stuff already. And I'm sorry, I've got to move on. And you're almost sort of knowingly leaving people behind, because you've got so many things to prioritize. So I'm not saying this is easy. It's something we need to be aware of, that students get left behind a lot. And so going back and forward in our teaching has to be something we're really ready for constantly. Now let's have a look at this sort of idea. A scheme that builds doesn't just happen in a linear order. Imagine your knowledge of, say, geography. So here's a map. There's the UK and there's the world map. Now you think about your own knowledge of the world, countries and where they are, and how many different countries you can label in, say, South America or Africa or Southeast Asia, the capitals maybe. And over the years that you have been learning about geography, your knowledge of the world will have developed and developed and developed and developed. And it'd be hard to sort of sequence that into a neat order. You just gain more and more depth, that knowledge. It's a kind of emergent, evolving process. And that is what a schema building is like. It's in most knowledge domains, you deepen and widen over time. So when you're planning a sequence of curriculum planning, you've got to have this need to revisit constantly, because you can't just sort of tick things off and say, done that, covered that, covered that, covered that, because different students will be experiencing that at different times. And that is a general rule for lots of things. But then if you look at something like this is one of my favorite primary school websites to go to, because I think their planning is great. They're Florence Melly Primary School in Liverpool. And you see here, this is just one of their documents, which is the geography curriculum map. And you can see how, different topics are there in the different years. So they've done a really good job of planning a sequence curriculum. But of course, that's in a time order, that they do this, then they do that, then they do this, then they do that. But if you look in the detail of that, you can see embedded in that is this sense of revisiting. They're planning to do this then, and then revisiting here and revisiting there. So they've got this idea that the students will mature, and its schema building can happen in this sort of organic way, because they are revisiting. And I think that that's something which you've got to think really hard about. This is a Key Stage 1 and 2 example, but you can't just plan the Year 3 geography curriculum on its own. That's the important message there. You have to plan it knowing where it fits into everything else. And to be honest with you, when you're a primary school teacher and you have to teach 10 or more subjects, that's pretty difficult to find the time for, but it is something you do need to do. You can't just think, I need to teach that. You always need to know where that fits into a wider scheme. And if you've been involved in some aspect of the planning of that, so much the better. And it definitely is true in secondary as well. So every year group is part of a wider map, and everybody needs to know what the map is. So that's important. Sometimes I think people overfuss about the specific map, as if you know, there's the ultimate curriculum plan, which is within reach. And I don't think it ever is. There's no sort of, there is no absolute path through geography. But whatever path you have mapped out, as long as you've thought a lot about different factors, is these, everyone needs to know what it is so that you know that this is coming next. And don't worry about this now because we'll revisit it again and we'll go deeper in year 6. And so only in year 4 we need to get this far. So that sense of the overview is important. And it applies to writing as well. So we're going to talk about writing more at the end of this talk, but writing is a classic example of where maturation is important. When you have to sort of have a sequence, you know, we start off with, you know, sounds and letters and shapes, but then words, and how we build a schema for writing has this organic feeling. But it also applies to lots of other things, math, science, everything has this sense of constantly needing to review. And your year 6 self has can revisit what you learned in year 3, and the stuff you learned in year 3 suddenly makes a lot more sense to you now. And then in year 9, you know, what you learned in year 6 makes a lot more sense now, because now you've got all these other things to connect to. So as you go through school, the stuff you learned before has still got to count, and the more we can fold in prior learning into new learning, the better, because then that's how schemas form. So let's have a look at reviewing materials as sort of classic Rosenshine. This is one of the 2 strands I'm going to look at: daily review, weekly and monthly review. There is a difference between them, and I think the main thing is that daily review is really about what I'd call activating prior knowledge. It's bringing knowledge to the fore, which was previously kind of just dormant. So making so that we can then use it. So if I was going to say, talk to you about, I could just pick something out of the air, like we're going to talk about global warming. Okay, maybe you weren't thinking about global warming a minute ago, but now you are. And I don't have to do too much to activate your prior knowledge about global warming. In fact, I can just say something like, imagine you were going to explain global warming to your younger brother. What would you say to them? You know, and that is activating prior knowledge. I don't have to do a quiz. I can just get people thinking about that. And that's what you're doing. And that's important because we're now going to be learning more about that. So I'm activating your prior knowledge. And daily review can have that feeling. It's bringing knowledge that has been previously learned to the fore, and maybe checking some details are there. Whereas weekly and monthly review are more about, we learned all the stuff before, and we're a bit more precise about, do you know all of it? And do all of you know all of it? That's the key. And techniques for reviewing material in a weekly and monthly review need to be a bit more precise than the daily review, probably. But what sort of things do we need to include? So let me just, see if I can get this to work. Well, before I talk about that, these are some of the principles that I think help bring this alive. Retrieval practice needs to involve everyone. Now, you might think that's just the most obvious thing anyone can say, but I only put these things down because I see these things not being done. So it is possible for a teacher to quiz a class by asking one question at a time to an individual. So not everybody is being asked all the questions. And you might think, well, that's crazy, but it's because, you know, but that does happen. And so is everyone being asked all the questions is the first thing. Can they check their own answers? You know, you've got to make this thing high frequency. So can they check their answers quickly and easily? Were you clear about what they needed to know? You know, so we're not trying to catch people out. This isn't, you know, university challenge where we're trying to sort of ask hard questions from anything you might know. It's, you know, do you know the things that you're supposed to know? So being clear about what it is that you ought to know in advance, I think, is really important. Making it generative. Now, generative means that you bring things from prior knowledge without a stimulus. So I have been in lessons more often than I'd like to, where the teacher has allowed the students to look up the answers to quizzes in their books almost all the time. So generative means, do you know it? Not can I find it? And you need to be clear about that. Varying the diet is key. So we're going to talk about that in a second. You can't just quiz the same knowledge in the same way. And if you're going to make it part of a lesson, not take over the whole lesson, it's got to be time efficient and also zero marking, you know, so make it easy to do. Now here's an example of some knowledge. Now, I use this all the time because it's something which I find people know a bit about, but not maybe everything. Henry VIII's wives. If I was going to ask you to know about Henry VIII's wives, I can show a stimulus like that, and then that is a prompt for activating prior knowledge, and you could tell your partner, you know, what do you remember about them, what do you know about them, or I could ask you a more specific quiz like their names or some dates. And while you're looking at that, you have to engage in the generative process. Then I can get you to evaluate your knowledge, and I show you the answers, say the names, and then you can just tell me whether you knew them all. And you can all tell yourselves, do you know all of those? But of course, knowing the names of Henry VIII's wives is a pretty superficial bit of knowledge. It's just their names. And if you don't know much about them, who cares what their names are? So this is something that Dan Willingham talks about, is that the goal needs to be deep knowledge, and the shallow knowledge might be the road to that, but the goal always has to be deep knowledge. So that the story and the purpose behind learning Henry VIII's wives is we have to think about that. We don't really care if we can name them. What's the purpose of the story? It's to tell us about history, of England, of Britain. It's to do with the whole relationship between the church and the state and how that changed. And there's a whole range of sort of characters and stories and narratives that weave through the story of Henry VIII's wives. And once we get into the depth and the story and the narrative and the social and political significance of their lives and why they were, beheaded or died or divorced or whatever, then the names are just embedded in that. And it's much easier to remember who Anne Boleyn was, and then know Anne Boleyn is Anne Boleyn if you know her story and hers and so on. So when you pitch for it at a wider schema with narrative elements to it, the knowledge elements in that are much easier to remember later. So if I tell you the whole story of Anne Boleyn and Jane Seymour and how Jane Seymour died, but she gave birth to Edward, who later became the king, and so on and so on, then if I ask you what's the name of Edward's mum, Jane Seymour, you're much more likely to remember it. So we've got to remember that we're not just after some sort of tidbits of factoid. We're not just trying to say to children, who were Henry VIII's wives? Oh, well done, you remember all six. That's not important. What's important is, can you tell the whole story? And that leads us to the types of questions we're going to ask them. What sort of questions would you ask in order to stimulate recall of that knowledge set? Well, it does help to know what sort of depth to go into. It's not just anything you can possibly remember about Henry VIII's wives. To help children learn, we need to say, well, what sorts of things ought you know? And so things like this, that kind of knowledge organizer, helps to kind of prompt the sort of depth that we're after, and that's very useful, and that will be different for different age groups and so on. So knowledge organizers have this role of saying, this is the sorts of things you should know, but it's not everything you can know. It's just a kind of prompt, a cue to the level of knowledge you should be going for, and you should definitely all know at least all of this. So then that helps with the retrieval practice. How could you quiz on that? Well, lots of different ways. Of course, quizzing can help, because I might know as a teacher better questions to ask. But I always think retrieval practice, the purpose of it needs to be remembered. It's about training students to check their own knowledge. That's the reason for it. Because at the end of the day, they have to go and study and so on. And whenever you're doing retrieval practice in lessons, you've got to be thinking, am I training students to do this for themselves, or are they becoming totally dependent on me? So teacher-led quizzing is useful, but only if it trains the students to quiz themselves, because they need to be saying to themselves, do I know about Henry VIII's wives? What do I know? Where are my gaps? What do I still not understand? And quizzing itself can have lots of different formats. People can quiz themselves, quiz each other, quiz in pairs, silent quiz, just asking them, do I know it? Yes or no. But then they can do more elaborate things like explain to each other, to show things, demonstrate, put things in a sequence, or elaborative interrogation where they say, why, how, what was the reason? And they can do it in a pair, they can do it on their own, and so on. Summarizing, summarize the story of Henry VIII's wives. That's very useful. Or do a mind map of it. And then here's my mind map. Look at your mind map. What did you get? This is what I got. Well, there's so many different ways of doing it. And I think this is what varying the diet is about. It's about approaching the same knowledge in different ways, and so on. So reviewing material and the curriculum are totally intertwined here. What sorts of things we want them to know, at what level of depth, and then how do we then check that knowledge in different ways? All of these things have a strongly curriculum focus. So if I can just, I know this is absolutely ridiculous, but I do need somebody to tell me. I don't have a clock apart from on the top of my computer, so I'm doing okay. I'm going to keep going back to this. Okay, so the next thing I want to look at is sequencing the curriculum. Now, Rosenshine has this neat thing. I love this flow. So present new material in small steps, provide models which have which are elements of the curriculum, and scaffold. So this is, for me, this is a neat flow. Like, you plan the small steps, but you're aiming for ambitious knowledge for everybody. But how do we get there? Not everybody is at the same point, but we have to have the same ambitions for everybody. We're not saying you guys just learn this because you're not very smart. No, we're saying we're all pitching for this. This is the goal. We're all aiming for the top of the mountain. But some of you might need more help to get there. And I really think when we're talking about things like differentiation, this is the right language to be using. We're not lowering people's hopes or expectations or aspirations. We're just being realistic about the fact that some people need more guidance and support to get to our common ambitious goals. And I think that's an important message to get right. Let's have a look at some examples. So here I like this example because I think it just tells the story well. How do we sequence concepts? I'm just going to give you various subject examples. So here's one from national curriculum in Key Stage 1 and 2 to do with rocks. National curriculum says people should be taught to compare and group different types of rocks, describe how fossils are formed, and recognize rocks and organic matter makes soil. So that can sound pretty dry if you're not a specialist or you don't know much about it. You might think, well, what's all that about? But I think it's fantastic. These sort of jigsaw things come from Michael Tidd. When the national curriculum came out, I think 2013, he made these jigsaws, which I find very useful. So in year 3 and 4, in geography, it says, describe and understand climate, rivers, mountains, volcanoes, and earthquakes. Also, in science, in national curriculum, we've got classification of rocks. And in year 6, we've got the evolution and adaptation. Now, why is that good? I think the people who were doing this knew what they were doing, because what you've got here is you've got a sequence of curriculum which really helps tell the story. Why do we want to know about rocks in Key Stage 2? What's the point? Well, the thing is, rocks are the way we understand that the Earth is a living and a sort of dynamic entity which has been around for millions of years and billions of years, and at a time scale far exceeding human existence for sure, but also a life itself. And we know that because of how rocks behave. So rocks are a way of actually us understanding time. Now that's important because one of the things that kids first get interested in at Key Stage 2 is dinosaurs, and fossils are not magic. You learn about, we can see how layers form, we can understand that. You can make sort of, test tubes of soil falling down, and you can model that, and kids can see that with their own eyes. And then we can, dinosaurs, and like, it's a cheesy video, but dinosaurs in the museums all over the place, and kids are fascinated by dinosaurs. I mean, every 7-year-old has a model plastic dinosaur at home, I would imagine. And how do we explain that? Dinosaurs aren't magic. The fact that they were there in huge diversity and then now they're not at all. In fact, humans and dinosaurs didn't, coexist with a gap of 65 million years. How do we explain that? We need to understand about time and the fact that the dinosaurs were buried under rocks. So understanding that rocks have a dynamic aspect to them, that there's a layer forming aspect, and that tells us about the Earth being old, helps us explain something which the kids would engage with. So I think that's a clever sequencing. These things connect together. It then also gives us time for evolution to have happened. Now, we need to tell the story of evolution, the tree of life. Every living thing is one of the most magical things you can teach. Every living thing has common ancestors with every other living thing. It's a phenomenal concept. How can that have happened? Well, it happened because of the Earth being, 4.6 billion years old, and we know that because of rocks telling us the story, and fossils at different layers and so on. And evolution is in the year 6 curriculum for science. So if in year 6 when you're doing evolution, you've learned about rocks and you've talked a bit about the age of the Earth, then it makes a lot more sense. One of the things we need to be clear about is the problem with that diagram on the top. It's a very common, it's almost like a meme that you see in talking about, the evolution of man. Is that it shows a very modern looking chimpanzee here. And that can lead to the misconception that we have evolved from chimpanzees, and which is confusing when they're still around. And actually that's not actually true. What is true is that we have common ancestors with modern apes. So we have common ancestors with them, and we have diverged in at different points in time. And I think that's an important thing to get right. So when you're teaching the curriculum, you need to know the reason why it's there and common misconceptions. So part of your thinking is what diagrams and models should I be using in order to get an idea across that reinforces the correct view of things, not the incorrect thing. And what the diagram at the bottom is a better one than the one on the top, because it tells the truth. It tells the story of common ancestors and evolving down different paths, not this sort of weird sort of morphing idea that we've sort of morphed from a chimpanzee. So these are all ideas where actually, if you look at the national curriculum, there are some pretty smart people who wrote it, I think, and have got the sequencing built in. But if you're teaching that stuff, you need to know why it's there. You need to know what the order is. And when you're teaching rocks in year 3, you know the big significance of that. It's not just some dry kind of functional items in your hand. It's the big picture, the whole narrative that's going to flow from that. And being aware of that helps you teach it better. Maths is a classic idea for sequencing. How do we build fractions? I won't spend too long talking about this, but knowing that a quarter plus 2/3 has a problem because the denominators are different sizes, and so how do we add them up, and needing to find a common denominator. Now I encounter students all the time, mainly in FE, where they're doing retake maths, who can't add a quarter and 2/3, and the reason is because their schema for it is weak. They don't have a strong schema for numbers, and they hear the word a quarter, they don't even really immediately visualize what a quarter is. And if you ask them if 2/3 was bigger than a half, well, they would have to think about that. That wouldn't be obvious. So, and how can you get to 16 and not be able to add a quarter and 2/3? It's because at every step along the way, you've never really made sense of that in terms of a secure schema for fractions. And never mind all the process of adding the fractions and combining them together into 12ths and so on. So we need to be clear that we need to be able to go back. What if you find, if you're teaching year 8, that you've got a student who can't tell you if 2/3 is bigger than 3/5 or wouldn't know where to begin? You need to go back. You need to be prepared to go back. And it's one of my observations a lot, is that teachers can be quite reluctant to do that because they just feel like, how can I possibly teach everything else as well as move forward? But that is why students end up not doing very well at maths, because people haven't been prepared enough to go back when they've missed it at the time. You just have to. There's no option. If a student doesn't understand equivalent fractions in year 7, 8, 10, they need to go back to it. You just have to do it. And this is one of the things which is difficult. So when you're planning a curriculum, you've got to be thinking, what should they already know? Check, do they all know this? And if your diagnosis is no, they don't, well, then your curriculum plan has just changed, because you then do need to go back, and you've got to be able to be on your toes with this and be flexible. And yeah, some students will need it and some others won't, and that makes it hard. Then you need to have things like looking at the end. What will they need to be able to do at the end? So look to harder questions. This was a year 6 level 6 question in the old SAT. What sorts of things would they be able to do with fractions in the future? What sort of things will they be able to know? Here's a question I quite like. It's good to look at some questions and diagnose what knowledge they might need to have, and then build up. I find this quite a useful activity. What would you need to know to be able to solve this problem? And there's algebra in there. There's knowledge of prime numbers. But interestingly in this, there's also the complexity, which is that to answer this question, you need to make a choice. And I find that fascinating. So there are multiple right answers to this question, because you can choose any prime number. And often I found students, especially students who are a bit nervous and excessively compliant in their demeanor sometimes, would be very nervous because they don't want to be wrong. So they're not sure whether they're allowed to choose. And you'd have kids who are saying, can I use 11? Am I allowed to use 13? And you go, well, yeah, because they're prime numbers, but that's the confidence they need. So there's the knowledge, there's the discipline, there's also this sort of attitude to, yeah, choose, you pick a prime number, and as long as it's a prime number, it's okay. So they need to have had experience of that. And that's part of your curriculum, because it's the confidence building aspect of making choices is part of your curriculum in that context. Models. So Rosenshine talks about models. How do I explain algebra? Well, sometimes I need concrete things to hold an abstract idea on. what does 3 bracket A plus 4 mean? Well, I'll tell you what, I make plenty of 16-year-olds who got a grade 1 at Maths GCSE, well, it doesn't mean an awful lot. They will say, they'll read it out, they'll say 3 bracket A plus 4 bracket. And the bracket has no actual meaning to them. It's a word, they hear the word, but they don't know what it does. And despite multiple teachers having tried to explain it. And so you need to have some sort of concrete thing to look. It's just grouping things together. The stuff in the bracket means this. And this is an example of talking about the number of sweets in a jar, and we add 4 more to it, and then we have 3 lots of all of that, and we're trying to make something really abstract into something real, and that's part of curriculum thinking. Here's one of my favorite things. I could talk about this for a long time. Making links between abstract models and the reality. This is part of what modeling is, and you know, I've got some examples of this here. Look, ice and water. And I often find that students have not really had the hands-on experience of the real things that teachers are assuming they have had. You know, we talk about, you see a teacher will say things like, you know how water kind of, you know, takes the shape of its container, and the kids will go, yeah. We think, well, do you? Because you don't seem to when I ask you harder questions. So getting the students to actually do this, you know, to have this experience in their own hand of seeing how water behaves close up and looking at it with new eyes. And one of the things I've loved as a science teacher is doing things like giving kids their own block of ice, like their own ice cube, and on the table, like they're allowed to have it on the table and let it melt and make a puddle. And when it's their own ice cube in their own hand and they're going, what, it becomes fascinating for the first time for some kids. They're going, whoa, look at my cube. Oh, it's all melting, whoa, and they're excited, and you're saying, well, how is that happening? You know, why does it suddenly melt faster in your hand? You know, what's going on? And you can start talking about energy and particles, and it's kind of vivid and real for them. And schema building isn't all about just telling people stuff and then testing them on it. My God, no. It's about making the real world, you know, make sense. And often that's to do with giving them experiences. And so holding a piece of ice in your hand and seeing it melt is an experience which teaches you a lot. Now you have to plan into your curriculum, because that's part of the schema building process, making sense of things. And abstract ideas are incredibly difficult. A lot of people, you know, don't really get the idea. Why does ice float on water? Why is ice almost unique as a solid that floats on its liquid form? It's to do with the structure, and that's quite hard to understand, but at least getting a sense that that's true is something that you can all experience. So, I mean, I could go on about this, but this idea of, you know, linking abstract ideas to concrete experiences is a big part of thinking in lots of subjects. So it's helpful to have some key ideas, the big ideas that you're threading through: particles, energy, cells. These are all science ideas, but what are the big ideas that you reference repeatedly and can embed in nearly every lesson? This is brilliant. I love this guy, Christopher Such. He's on Twitter as Suchmo83. In his Key Stage 1 and 2 curriculum, they have this fantastic thing called the Big Ideas in Science, which they've written. Here's their chemistry ones. And there are just 3 for each of the sciences, and plus they have earth sciences. And I love it. Sort of, and if you've thought through your curriculum and you've thought out the big ideas at this sort of level, you're really going to teach things really well. So, you know, matter can change if the arrangement of these building blocks changes. Really, really good thinking. And then your knowledge organizer, you know, makes sense to everybody because you've connected it up. So some people go ahead and they think, we've got to plan a curriculum, we've got to make a knowledge organizer. But this is a reminder. You know, think of all the stuff that's in there. This is a reminder, which is useful, but it only makes sense if all the other stuff has been planned in: the experiences, the schema building, the order of the topics, the bigger picture. And then this helps you remind of the things that we've already done. It isn't the curriculum. Knowledge organizers are not that. But this is what I think is then fascinating. Now, once we've done ice, water, and steam, you know, in a kind of sciencey way, the geography story of the water cycle, which is at Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3, this is a big version, wasn't it? We're using the same words. We could talk about condensation. We could talk about how energy is needed to change state from a liquid to a gas, and we've got this macro version of it. So again, knowing how the water cycle in geography connects to states of matter in science, this is where curriculum thinking needs to come together. This is all about really knowing the sequence of concepts isn't just within your little part of the curriculum in your year group. It's to do with the whole bigger picture and how it connects. And that, I think that's important to get that. I've got various other science examples. I won't go into this too much, but things like knowing how to explain something like the phases of the moon, getting the right diagrams. So this is an example where you need to get the scale right. You need knowing how small the moon is compared to the Earth and how far away the distance is. That helps you explain it. But if you only ever show them this diagram, that's, does that help you explain the phases of the moon? Well, not on its own, but together they do, and choosing the right resources to provide the right visual spatial models for a concept is part of curriculum thinking. Knowing how to link the same idea in different ways. So here you've got a visual, we heated up some green stuff, we made some black stuff, which they've got names, copper carbonate and copper oxide. They have symbolic forms, and we're trying to visualize the particles and get across this concept that atoms have the same atoms at the beginning are the ones we have at the end. And you're trying to link, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to link abstract, concrete, visuals to words. It's linking all these ideas, which deepens understanding. And at every subject, you've got these sorts of equivalents. How do we approach the same idea in different ways in order to deepen the schema? What about this example? I want to explain how motors work. At what point do I introduce the formula? Well, I've seen some kids who only see this. They're faffing about with this Fleming's left-hand rule and some equation, but they've never done this. They've never seen or played with a motor. They don't really know what it's about. So I would say, teach this in year 7 or 8. Get kids making motors. Talk sort of, in fairly general terms about rotation and speed and the force and the feeling of it, knowing that in year 10 that we're going to bang out this equation, that we're going to learn it. And it's a combination of this sort of tacit knowledge of how things work in real life with the abstract idea of the equation, which makes this make sense. But we don't have to obsess about the equation in year 8. That's too difficult for most kids. So we won't worry about that. We know that's coming later, but we must make sure we give this experience. So it's perfectly valid to give kids purely experiential learning, knowing that they formalize it later. And that again, requires a level of confidence that your spiral curriculum is going to happen and be delivered. What about the level of depth? I like this question because you can ask this in year 2. I've seen year 7-year-olds who had a fantastic lesson with their teacher, all about, they run around the playground, they're all out of breath, and they can talk about why they're out of breath. And that's a really good discussion. You can have a deeper discussion in year 6, a deeper discussion in year 9. And by the time they're in year 11, well, they should be really talking about equations and know all about respiration and anaerobic respiration. So one of the things you need to be thinking about in your curriculum planning is the depth of knowledge. The concepts are similar, but at what level of depth? And you model this through your answers and you scaffold up. So, in every subject, whether it's history or geography, economics, whether it's poetry, what prior knowledge is needed? What's the level of depth? Do the students have the knowledge? And you need to be thinking. I've seen some really lovely schemes of work which are planned with this in mind, which is they have a sort of box at the top, expected prior knowledge, and then the process is checking for that prior knowledge, checking that everyone has it. And guess what? If the students don't have it, you don't just say, well, go away and learn it. You have to sort of make sure they understand it, because if it's prerequisite, they need to have that knowledge in order to then to move on with the topic that you're doing. So I think that's a really good part of good curriculum planning, is the prior knowledge books, because let's face it, we want all of the students to know all of the stuff, and the weakest students are the ones we're most worried about. And if they can't deal with the prior knowledge, then why are we carrying on with more? We've got to have that flexibility, as I said before about the maths. It applies to all of these things. Okay, I'm just going to do a quick time check. I'm really sorry about this, but it's just that I've got a few more minutes and I'm going to stop. The last example I want to give is about writing. So I think it's probably the most common schema building thing that we have is writing. How do we build writing? Well, writing has many elements, doesn't it? Writing has words, so we need to decide what words we want the students to have. And you can't just hit and hope on this. Deliberate vocab development is an important part of curriculum, thinking. And we need to give students plenty of practice with a specific set of words. And I'm often seeing students oversaturated with too many words that they are trying to learn and not practicing any one of them very often. So you need a level of frequency with words. So you need to be more selective. These are the words now, then some more, then some more, then some more. And if you've used the word multiple times in different ways, then you're more likely to remember it and use it. So don't just like, you have to build slowly. So there's words, there's grammar. And that is which bits of grammar are we all teaching? These are the grammar questions. Do we understand the grammar? But then it all gets integrated. So you can't deconstruct writing into these tiny elements on its own. It all has to be integrated, and we need examples and rubrics. And this is where the whole quality model idea and Daisy Christodoulou's amazing work on comparative judgment comes in. How do we describe to children how to improve their work? I often use this in my CPD. Which of these is a better picture? Well, we could debate them. We wouldn't all agree, especially the ones on the right there. We wouldn't all agree which one was the better rainbow picture, even if that's a legitimate concept. But we could certainly have a meaningful conversation to the child on the left and say, here are different ways you can make your rainbow painting a bit more sophisticated, and we could show them examples. And that's an easier way of getting that idea across than just telling them, verbally how to do it. We need to show them. So part of curriculum planning is modeling how success manifests itself in different ways. And I think that's a strong kind of Rosenshine thing. Modeling and scaffolding is often about showing examples and then discussing the features of them. What are the features of them? And then we can make rubrics from that. And this is where the moderation materials in writing come in. You see an example alongside the annotations with the criteria, and you can understand that this is a more sophisticated piece of writing than this because of certain reasons. And then you can start discussing that with students. And one of the things I like about Rosenshine is at the end, the scaffolding has to come down. So scaffolding is a great word. Scaffolding gets you somewhere, but it must come down if we are to succeed. And this is the same thing with stabilizers. We put stabilizers on a bike to get you the feeling of riding a bike, but we can't really say we can ride a bike unless we take the stabilizers off. But we need to plan what's the equivalent of the stabilizers in your subject. What things do you give your students to give them the feeling of confidence? And I'm going to end on this. This is one of my favorite examples of scaffolding, which comes from my own son. So I found this in this room that I'm sitting now. I found this in a box of his stuff last year. He wrote this poem. I found it when he was 7. Just have a quick look at that. I'll just read out the last line. Nor did I know before sun could make the sea golden like straw turning into gold. And when I first saw that, I just was blown away. Like, my son was 7, he wrote that incredible poem. But I thought, actually, it seemed a bit too good to be true. So I Googled it and I found this. So like, okay, I was a bit crestfallen at that moment, but so he wasn't that much of a genius at that time. But his teacher was, because what his teacher was doing was scaffolding, was showing my son in year 2 that writing can do amazing things. If we structure poetry in a certain way, we can emulate it, and then we can get a feeling for words playing on, with imagery and so on, if we structure them in a certain format and structure and form. So this was a scaffold. This was a scaffold for writing a poem, which would then teach him something. Of course, if Nessie can do it on his own, he hasn't really learnt very much, but he would have the chance after that. So this is a classic example of a curriculum decision about the type of scaffold we produce. We look at Lillian Moore's poem, then we get the students to write one of their own. That's the curriculum, that's the modelling and the scaffolding coming together. And things like the types of words that we, structures that we use in writing are all models and scaffolds. And ultimately, we build up to whole extended writing. We're showing exemplar writing, deconstructing that paragraph, that answer, that maximum score answer for this history essay teaches a lot. There's a lot of knowledge content in there. There's structure to the paragraphs. There's the answering the question aspect of it. It's not just writing stuff about Hungary in 1956. It's answering this specific question. So there's so much modelling embedded in a big, rich discussion about why that is a full mark answer. But if you just looked at the success criteria, it's gibberish. demonstrates a range of accurate and detailed knowledge and understanding. And nobody understands that on its own. You have to see an example. It comes alive. Oh, okay, that's what they mean. That's what it looks like. It becomes clear. And of course, then the students need to be able to do that on their own independently in the end. But to begin with, just writing a one paragraph for 4 marks would be a start, wouldn't it? And then maybe a second one. And so we need to scale up our practice activities so that students are practicing at the level they're at, not just being dumped in deep end and doing an 8-mark answer when they're not really ready or they don't have the knowledge. So something like this, a knowledge quiz about events in Hungary in 1956 would be a good beginning. Do you know the facts? Yeah, okay. Right, now can you write an explanatory paragraph? That's the second wave, and so on. So your sequencing of your curriculum is to have this feeling of laddering up the stages and being very deliberate and knowing about that. Okay, so I think we're about out of time, so I'm just going to finish up there. Last thing to say is this. Everyone knows Rosenshine's principles are common sense, don't they? That's what people always say to me, but not everybody enacts them with maximum fluency because they're not always easy. So it's not about do you do them or not, it's about how well you do them. Do you do them intensively enough? Do you do them with enough detail in your curriculum thinking? And do you enable all the students to engage with the curriculum? That's the challenge, not just some, but all. And that's where it's harder to enact these things than some people might say. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop there. There's a full Rosenshine masterclassing I've done. A lot of people seem to be accessing this. It's just on my website and on my Twitter. There's about each of these videos, and we can see the lengths there. And it's me talking through them in a much more sort of slow and steady way. And that's just free for anyone to access whenever you like. So I hope you find that useful. So I'm going to stop talking now. I hope you found that useful. And now I'm going to take questions. I don't know, Elena, if you're going to give me the questions or what, but I'll just...
Yes, we've had quite a few questions. Some people are a bit concerned about mixed attaining classes. And what would be the quickest way to address a lack of prior knowledge with 1 to 3 students, very few students in a very diverse mixed attaining class? So how would you do that without having to run intervention classes all year round?
So with mixed attaining classes, I think there are a couple of things. One of them is I think you need to be even more precise about what the knowledge is. So that if that's vague, it's hard. I mean, if you're saying that this is what you should all know, and then you teach them to study, you give them practice tasks or recall activities, which they can do more independently. So for example, I don't know, that most recent example I gave in there about the story about Hungary. Well, you have to diagnose what the students can't do. Is it they just don't know the facts? If it's in fractions, if you're adding fractions and finding that difficult, what practice tasks can I give the students who are not yet up to speed? And you need to just design those sorts of things. So knowledge retrieval or practice activities, which the students who are not up to the level you're hoping can still go on to do more practice of. And I think that should be a big part of curriculum thinking, is designing practice tasks for students who are behind and giving those to the students as a sort of a mainstay of their extra study.
Do you mean during the lesson, or do you mean as
during the lesson and beyond it? Because I think that's something which, students who are behind need to catch up. They need to do extra. And I think that's quite an obvious thing. Where you do find students do catch up, they don't just do it by not doing less work, they have to do more. And so you have to give them the tools. So sometimes it's not about doing more material, but more intensity of practice. So practicing the same thing more. So a lot of homework activities can be just, here's the same stuff, just do it again. Like if I need to practice my piano scales, I don't need to know more scales. I need to do the same scales again, better, more fluently. So keep within the same material. Don't keep adding more to them. Just keep them practicing the same stuff. Another thing I'd say is having tiered question sets. I'm a big fan of that. So when I see that in lessons, I think that's really good. You've got, levels of questions, which have got lots of questions within a difficulty range, but they're all on the same document, so that students within the same class can see the path forward. They're not being held back, but they are also able to practice at maybe a lower level than the person next to them, because that's where they're at. If it's just the same stuff for everybody, and it's too hard, well, then you're going to find that difficult. So The differentiation is problematic if you're saying you guys don't need to know this. That's terrible. But if it's, look, there are steps. You're on step 1, you're on step 2, you're on step 3, and everyone can see the steps and they're accessible. That's how I would approach it.
Thank you. We've had a few questions as well, asking, it's something you said towards the beginning. You were talking about retrieval practice at the start of the lesson. Someone said Rosenshine highlights retrieval practice at the beginning of a lesson should be knowledge that will be used in the immediate lesson. And so someone was asking, do you believe that lesson start of factual recall tasks should include other topics or just the knowledge that is needed for today's lesson? What's the tension there?
I think you need to be clear about that. Rosenshine is describing some general tendencies. And so he's saying, sometimes teachers use a quiz at the start of the lesson, that's useful. But, Rosenshine, there's a broader thing which is to do with retrieval practice in general. So I think you can't be too absolute. There might be a lesson where you start with a retrieval because you're going to build on that knowledge. So I need to move on today. So before I move on, I'm going to check the knowledge that I'm expecting them all to have. That's my focus today because I need them all to know that. And that might be on Tuesday. On Friday, we're going to do a starter, which is actually more like a weekly review. We're going to check various other bits of knowledge because I want to make sure that we are keeping our prior knowledge live. And so you just decide. You have to decide. There's no rule about that. It's just, what's the purpose? Today, I need you to really activate prior knowledge, so we're going to build on it. That's my focus. Tomorrow, we're going to do a more broad range of questions because I need you to remember a broader range. So that is entirely up to you to decide. There is no truth about one is better than the other.
Okay, thank you. Another interesting question. What approach do you follow when there are contrasting concepts or theories or opinions along the way of the schema building process? I've had that several times in my own lessons, in my own planning. So I suppose the question is about the sequence here. How do you go about teaching that if there are contrasting concepts or theories?
Well, I think it depends what the level of the students are, but I think that's one of the richnesses of learning, is that you need to I think sometimes you need to give students a kind of a platform. Certainly as a science teacher, I found that you start off with a simplified model. Or in history, it's like, here's some sort of some commonly agreed events. This is the basic structure. And then once people have got a handle on the kind of a framework for the discussion, you can start saying, it could be a text, what's the basic story telling us? But some people's interpretation is this, some people's interpretation of that. So you've got to build the kind of the framework for the discussion first before you then start talking about competing views, because otherwise, and that's how I do it. So, and I would present it in as, most people that, the general consensus is this, but actually there are debates here and there. And then that's how I would do that. But you need to have some toehold that's common. Otherwise people feel insecure about any of the ideas.
Yeah. Can I just squeeze in the last question? Any ideas for providing experiential learning remotely?
Well, I think to think of things which everybody can access. So, when I've got my ice here, I mean, everyday items like that people might have at home, which they can do. The problem is if you're planning things which not everybody can do, if you start saying, everybody go to the museum, even, we're back at normal school, then not everyone is. But think of things which everyone can do at home, which are realistic. And then you just give them instructions, go and try this, go and try that, and see it, and get some feedback on that. But I would definitely be thinking about as low resource intensive as possible, nothing that costs money particularly. That's what you need to do. But I think you can describe things which people can do at home that are pretty universal within a range. It depends what the subject is, of course.
Thank you very much, Tom. We're going to have to stop here. There are quite a few other questions, so I will make sure that you get them, just that you can see the range of questions that were asked, and you might want to address them later on Twitter or something. Thank you very much. That was a really
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining me. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.